Today, we're going to be telling a ghost story. And it seemed to us the best way to go about this is to first just tell the story.
And afterwards, we'll go through the pieces that may have some truth behind them, as well as some context around the time and the area of the story.
This is the story of the haunting of Stalter's Gully. In the 1870s, a rift formed amongst the congregation of the Jubilee Church. With the two sides unable to come to an understanding, the church split in two, one faction going off to start a new church and the remainder staying with the Jubilee. In the midst of this turmoil were a young man and young woman who were deeply in love. With each church angry at the other, the families grew bitter towards each side, and the parents of the young couple forbade them from seeing each other. The heartbroken young woman left her family's home and took her own life, drowning herself in the nearby pond at Stalter's Gully. The girl's family, knowing she was distraught and unable to find her, put together a search party. By the end of that day, her remains had been discovered, floating out there in Stalter's Gully. Her body was brought back to the family home and placed on her bed until the undertaker could arrive the next morning. But as soon as the young woman's body was brought into the home, the family started to experience strange things. First, they started hearing noises from the bedroom the body was in, but found nothing when they entered. They noticed that although their daughter had been brought in soaking wet from being in the pond, the bed was still strangely dry. Windows started blowing open, despite having been locked and with no wind present. A man that had been leaning against the door was thrown across the room when the door was knocked open by some invisible force. Early the next morning, when trying to do the chores, one of the men tried lifting a pitchfork but could not. Calling for help, more men tried, but no one could make it budge. These strange happenings continued until the young woman's body was taken away by the undertaker, seemingly leaving with her. But a short time later, a new apparition began appearing on the roads around Stalter's Gully. A wailing figure would be seen pacing the road at night, often scaring the horses and riders who caught a glimpse. After 30 years, the sightings stopped. It so happened to be the same time that the young man, now grown old, had passed away.
So that's the story. Bit of a Romeo and Juliet kind of thing with a ghostly twist. Let's dive in and talk about the parts of the story that could be based on real facts. One of the first things Pete and I noticed when we visited was how nondescript Stalter's Gully is. At the time of the story, the area looked very different though. So we're going to turn back time for a minute to explain how it came to look like it does now. In 1966 and 67, probably the biggest change to the landscape happened when they switched from bridges and put in a culvert. So they essentially filled in this part of Stalter's Gully and built the road over top. If we go back another 45 years into the 1920s, we see the steel bridge that came before the culvert was constructed. And here we really start to see how much the land has changed. It's been cleared of most trees here, but you can see the gully and the stream. Continuing into the past, and now to the old wooden bridge, this picture wasn't dated, but we know it at least came before the steel one, so we're at least 100 years closer to the story now. Other things to keep in mind are that in the 1870s, there were ponds and dams with working mills in Stalter's Gully. So it wasn't just a barren stream running through nature, but an active part of the community. While the look of the place has changed quite a bit, the layout of the area is pretty similar. Here's the map as it is now. And here's the map at the time of the story. I'll point out a few places to keep in mind as we continue. Here's Stalter's Gully. You'll see a body of water right near the road. This could potentially be where the girl drowned herself. Here's the Grove's End Cemetery, the Jubilee Church and Cemetery, and the Berean Church and Cemetery. In the story, the original church is the Jubilee Church. And in the 1860s, there was a disagreement between the congregation over the election of some new deacons. This eventually led to a group splitting from the Jubilee Church and starting the Berean Baptist Church. The young woman's family was supposedly one of the families that remained with the Jubilee Church. The young man's family was supposedly part of the faction that left to start the Berean Church. This is about all the real info we have. So the story does start with some truth, in that being that feud within the church. Part of the backstory is that the young woman was buried in the Grove's End Cemetery. Not the Jubilee Cemetery. Whether this was because her family was ashamed of the act or it was the church's policy, I'm not sure. The young man was supposedly buried in the Berean Cemetery many years later. Going back to the end of the story, some people believed it was him out there on the roads at night and not a ghost, as sightings stopped after his death. The biggest hurdle to verifying any more of the story, and I mean, it's not like we're going to verify the haunting part anyways, but is that we don't have the names. The story provides us with all the locations, but not with who these two young lovers were, if they really did exist. It's up to you to decide how far you want to believe the story, but it shows that in these local legends, there's often some grain of truth from which the story grew.